In the early 1930s, Harlem did not run on laws. It ran on understanding. There were police precincts, courtrooms, and city officials, but none of them truly decided how Harlem functioned day to day. The real structure of the neighborhood lived somewhere else, inside quiet agreements, shared expectations, and rules that were never written down because everyone already knew them. Those rules weren't enforced loudly. They didn't need to be. Everyone knew where they began. No one could ever say where they ended. To an outsider, Harlem appeared loud and chaotic. Music poured out of nightclubs well past midnight. Sidewalks stayed crowded long after other parts of the city went quiet. Arguments spilled into the streets, and laughter followed them just as easily. It looked unrestrained, unpredictable, alive. But beneath that noise was a careful order. People knew when to speak, when to listen, and when to step aside. Not because they feared violence, but because they understood consequences. Violence was obvious. Consequences were not. And in Harlem, the unseen consequences mattered far more. There were men who controlled territory. Men who controlled money. And men who controlled silence. Silence, more than anything else, was what kept Harlem from tearing itself apart. When something happened that wasn't meant to be known, the neighborhood absorbed it. The story didn't disappear, but it stopped traveling. It remained contained, held quietly by those who understood its weight. There was an unspoken line. Everyone felt it. No one announced it. You could operate around Harlem. You could profit from Harlem. You could even threaten Harlem. But crossing that line meant something entirely different. It meant you weren't just challenging a person, you were challenging an order designed to prevent chaos. By the early 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had become more than a name in Harlem. He was a reference point. When disputes surfaced, his name came up, not as a threat, but as a measure. People asked how far something could go. They asked who would notice. They asked whether a move would be remembered. Often, they didn't have to ask out loud. What mattered wasn't whether Bumpy Johnson was present. What mattered was whether people believed he would hear about it. Harlem functioned on that belief. The understanding that certain actions, once taken, could not be undone with money, apologies, or explanations. The line existed to prevent escalation. Crossing it guaranteed the opposite. In 1934, that line was still intact. Tested at times, certainly, but respected. Even among criminals, there was a hierarchy of mistakes. Some could be corrected. Some could be paid for. Others altered how the city looked at you forever. The worst ones were never written down. Dutch Schultz did not come from Harlem. He hadn't grown up inside its rhythms or learned its quiet rules. His reputation was built elsewhere, through intimidation, speed, and an appetite for confrontation. Schultz understood power as something you seized and defended, loudly if necessary. To him, territory was territory. Influence was influence. And silence usually meant fear. That assumption would matter later. At the time, Harlem was valuable, not just financially, but symbolically. It was visible. It mattered who controlled it, who passed through it, and who dared to claim authority there. Schultz saw opportunity. What he did not see, what he could not see, was the difference between operating in Harlem and operating over it. Those who knew Harlem well sensed the tension before anything openly happened. Small things changed. Conversations ended sooner. Meetings became shorter. Names were spoken more carefully. People paid closer attention to who entered certain rooms, and who did not. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make a headline. But Harlem had always been sensitive to subtle shifts. It was how the neighborhood protected itself. When something threatened the balance, people didn't panic. They waited. They watched. They listened. They understood that when a line is approached, it rarely announces itself. And when it is crossed, it does not ask for permission. By the time anyone outside Harlem realized something was wrong, it was already too late to prevent it. The rule had been broken quietly, the way the most serious mistakes always are. Not with gunfire. Not with shouting. But with a decision made by someone who believed the rules did not apply to him. Afterward, witnesses would say the city felt different. Not louder. Not more violent. Quieter. As if everyone was waiting for something that could not be undone. The papers would never fully explain it. The records would never clarify it. And those who understood what had happened would never put it into words. Because the line that was crossed in 1934 was never meant to be explained. If you value stories that stay true to history, the parts that were recorded and the parts that were intentionally left out, take a second to like the video and subscribe. This channel is built for stories exactly like this one. Dutch Schultz had never believed much in invisible limits. Where he came from, rules were enforced loudly. Territory was claimed openly. Power announced itself through fear, repetition, and spectacle. Schultz's reputation had been built on that kind of certainty. When he wanted something, people knew it. When he moved, others adjusted around him. That approach had worked for a long time. By the early 1930s, Schultz was already a known quantity in New York's criminal world. He wasn't subtle, but he didn't need to be. His violence was direct. His grudges were public. His victories were meant to be seen. To him, authority was something you demonstrated until no one challenged it. Harlem, F. It was profitable. It was busy. And it appeared, at least on the surface, to lack a single visible hand guiding it. Schultz didn't see quiet order. He saw opportunity masked as confusion. And like many men before him, he assumed that whatever structure existed there could be broken the same way others had been, quickly, forcefully, and without apology. What Schultz didn't understand was that Harlem's restraint wasn't weakness. It was containment. Men who worked around him noticed early signs of friction. Harlem didn't respond to pressure the way other neighborhoods did. Threats didn't ripple outward. Displays of force didn't echo. They seemed to disappear. Schultz interpreted that silence as hesitation. It wasn't. Those close to him tried, carefully, to explain. Not directly, because explaining Harlem directly was a mistake in itself, but through suggestion. They mentioned names. They spoke about conversations that had ended without resolution. They described meetings that hadn't gone the way Schultz expected. Bumpy Johnson's name came up more than once. Schultz did not ignore the name. But he misread what it represented. He saw Johnson as a gatekeeper, not a stabilizer. Someone who could be pressured, replaced, or bypassed. Schultz had dealt with men like that before. Men who appeared important until someone proved they weren't. The difference, which Schultz failed to grasp, was that Bumpy Johnson's authority did not depend on constant enforcement. It depended on memory. On precedent. On what had already happened, and what people believed would happen again if necessary. Schultz operated in the present tense. Harlem operated in the long one. As Schultz pushed further, the neighborhood didn't erupt. It didn't resist openly. Instead, it adjusted. Certain doors closed. Certain conversations stopped happening. Information traveled more slowly. People who once returned calls did not do so anymore. In his world, resistance announced itself. It didn't withdraw quietly. So when Harlem did neither, Schultz assumed he was succeeding. That assumption reinforced his confidence, and confidence, for Schultz, always invited escalation. He wanted acknowledgement. Not negotiation. Not understanding. Acknowledgement. The mistake was subtle, but fatal. Schultz didn't just want access, he wanted recognition of authority. He wanted to be treated as someone whose presence alone reshaped the balance of power. In Harlem, that kind of demand carried meaning far beyond business. Because authority in Harlem wasn't granted by intimidation. It was earned through restraint. Through the ability to resolve conflict without attracting attention. Through understanding which battles never needed to be fought. Schultz had never learned that lesson. His success had insulated him from it. By early 1934, the tension had become visible to those who knew how to look. Meetings grew shorter. Locations changed without explanation. Names were avoided. Even men accustomed to risk spoke more carefully than before. Bumpy Johnson noticed all of it. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't issue warnings. He didn't send messages. That, too, was deliberate. Harlem's rules allowed for correction, up to a point. Sometimes men tested boundaries without realizing it. Sometimes they could be redirected without consequence. But that required humility. Schultz did not offer any. Instead, he pressed harder. Not violently, not yet, but deliberately. He wanted to force a response. To confirm what he believed. That Harlem's calm was an illusion, and that its leadership would bend when challenged openly. What he didn't realize was that every step he took narrowed his options. By the time the situation reached Bumpy Johnson directly, it was already beyond casual correction. The issue was no longer territory or money. It was respect. And respect, once challenged publicly, could not be restored quietly. Those who understood Harlem's internal logic knew what that meant. The confrontation, when it came, did not arrive suddenly. It was not a surprise. It felt, to those who sensed it, inevitable. The city had reached a point where something had to give, not because of aggression, but because of insistence. Schultz believed persistence was strength. Harlem understood it as provocation. The rule Schultz had broken was not written anywhere. No sign marked it. No warning explained its consequences. But everyone who lived within Harlem's boundaries understood it instinctively. You could not demand recognition in a place built on balance. By the time Schultz realized he was no longer being ignored but observed, the situation had already changed. The conversations he thought he controlled were no longer happening around him. Decisions were being made elsewhere, without his input. That was the moment his confidence began to work against him. Still, Schultz believed in escalation. He believed that pressure always produced results. He believed that silence meant uncertainty. And he believed, above all, that reputation could solve problems before they became dangerous. What he did not believe in was restraint. And in Harlem, restraint was the line. The moment Schultz finally forced the issue, the moment he crossed from pressure into challenge, was not dramatic. No guns were drawn. No voices were raised. It didn't look like a turning point. But those who were close enough to feel it understood immediately. Something had shifted. The choice had been made. And once that line was crossed, there was no version of the future where it could be uncrossed. The moment did not announce itself. There was no crowd. No raised voices. No visible threat. If someone had walked past at the wrong time, they might not have noticed anything unusual at all. Just men standing still. Just a pause that lingered a second longer than it should have. That was how it happened. In Harlem, confrontations rarely looked the way outsiders expected. They didn't arrive with gunfire or chaos. They arrived quietly, shaped by context rather than force. This one was no different. The room, whether by coincidence or design, was neutral enough to feel safe. That was part of the mistake. Dutch Schultz believed control was something you demonstrated. He had pushed until a response became unavoidable, and now he had it. The setting didn't matter to him. What mattered was that the moment had arrived, and that he intended to be acknowledged. Bumpy Johnson did not come prepared to argue. Those who knew him noticed that immediately. He didn't posture. He didn't bring unnecessary people. He didn't try to dominate the space. He listened first. That alone changed the temperature of the room. Schultz was used to resistance that announced itself. Calm unsettled him. The exchange began as business. It always did. Territory. Operations. Influence. Words chosen carefully enough to sound negotiable, but firm enough to signal expectation. Schultz spoke as someone accustomed to being answered. Johnson responded as someone who did not need to convince anyone of his position. The line was crossed not by a threat, but by an assumption. At some point, later, no one could agree exactly when, Schultz stopped speaking as if he were dealing with a partner. He spoke as if the outcome had already been decided. As if recognition was owed. As if Harlem's silence had been consent. That was the mistake. It was subtle. Easy to miss. But those who understood Harlem's internal logic felt it immediately. The shift from discussion to declaration. From negotiation to expectation. Schultz wasn't just pressing for advantage anymore, he was dismissing the balance that allowed the conversation to exist in the first place. Bumpy Johnson did not interrupt him. That, too, mattered. Johnson let Schultz finish. He let the word settle. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise. There was no warning embedded in it. No explicit refusal. He didn't threaten consequences or outline boundaries. He corrected the assumption. Not directly. Not forcefully. But clearly enough that there could be no misunderstanding. The correction was brief. Measured. Final. Witnesses later struggled to repeat exactly what was said. Not because they didn't remember the words, but because the meaning wasn't contained in them. It was in the delivery. In the certainty. In the absence of negotiation. Johnson did not explain Harlem's rules. He didn't justify them. He didn't defend his authority. He spoke as someone stating a fact that required no elaboration. Schultz heard it. What happened next was the real crossing of the line. Instead of adjusting, Schultz pushed back. Not loudly. Not violently. But openly. He challenged the correction itself. Questioned it. Dismissed it as posturing. In doing so, he revealed something he hadn't intended to, that he did not recognize the structure he was standing inside. In Harlem, that kind of challenge wasn't interpreted as confidence. It was interpreted as disrespect. The room went quiet. This wasn't the silence of fear or shock. It was the silence of recognition. The kind that settles when everyone present understands that something irreversible has just occurred. Not because of what was said, but because of what was denied. Schultz believed reputation could carry him through the moment. That force of personality could override context. That the confrontation itself would resolve things in his favor simply by taking place. But Harlem did not resolve disputes that way. Bumpy Johnson did not argue further. He did not escalate. He did not retaliate in the moment. He did something far more decisive, he ended the conversation. No dramatics. No ultimatums. Just closure. That was when those present understood the line had been crossed. Not because Schultz had been aggressive, but because he had refused to listen. Because he had insisted on recognition instead of understanding. Because he had challenged something that existed specifically to prevent what would now follow. Schultz left believing the confrontation had gone unfinished. He was wrong. In Harlem, the end of a conversation was often the beginning of consequences. The absence of immediate response was not mercy, it was process. Decisions were not made in the room. They were made afterward, collectively, through silence. Bumpy Johnson did not issue orders that day. He did not call meetings. He did not need to. The structure he represented did that work for him. The moment Schultz challenged the balance publicly, the outcome became less about Johnson and more about the system that sustained him. People noticed changes almost immediately. Not announcements. Not retaliation. Just adjustments. Routes altered. Information delayed. Familiar faces suddenly unavailable. The kind of shifts that didn't point to action, but to preparation. Schultz, accustomed to visible resistance, did not recognize what he was seeing. He interpreted the quiet as uncertainty. As hesitation. As an opening. That misunderstanding sealed it. By the time Schultz realized something had gone wrong, the confrontation was already over. Not in his favor, and not in a way he could confront directly. The rules he had dismissed were now active, and they did not operate on his timeline. There would be no immediate reprisal to answer. No single person to confront. No clear move to counter. ONL. The line had not been crossed with violence. It had been crossed with refusal. And in Harlem, refusal carried a weight that force never could. Those who understood the neighborhood knew what came next wouldn't be visible. It wouldn't be discussed openly. It wouldn't appear in print. The consequences would arrive quietly, distributed across time and behavior rather than a single moment. Schultz had believed that pushing hard enough would produce clarity. Instead, it produced silence. And silence, in Harlem, was never empty. What followed did not arrive the way most people expect consequences to arrive. There were no gunshots echoing through the streets. No bodies in the papers. No police cordons or public funerals. In fact, for a brief moment, it appeared as if nothing had happened at all. The city moved. Businesses opened. Music played. Harlem looked the same. That was the point. In places governed by force, power announces itself. In Harlem, power withdrew. And that withdrawal carried meaning. Those who paid attention noticed it immediately. Those who didn't would only understand much later, if at all. The first signs were small. Familiar intermediaries stopped returning calls. Meetings that had been routine were postponed without explanation. People who once spoke freely grew cautious, choosing words more carefully, ending conversations earlier than usual. Nothing dramatic. Nothing actionable. But these were not accidents. Information, in Harlem, had always been currency. After the confrontation, that currency stopped circulating around Dutch Schultz. Not completely. Not obviously. Just enough to be felt by those who depended on it. Schultz. He assumed pressure was working against him, that someone was stalling, negotiating internally, deciding how to respond. He waited for resistance to reveal itself, because resistance was something he knew how to confront. What he did not understand was that resistance had already occurred. There were no messages sent to Schultz warning him to step back. No emissaries arrived to renegotiate terms. No threats were delivered. Harlem did not operate on ultimatums. It operated on consensus, and consensus did not require explanation. The absence of response was the response. Men who had once carried information across boundaries stopped doing so. Not because they were instructed to, but because they understood what the moment required. The system corrected itself quietly. No single decision, no central command. Just alignment. This was how Harlem protected itself. The newspapers reflected none of it. That absence was striking in its own way. In an era when even minor disturbances could be exaggerated into headlines, this shift passed without comment. No reports. No speculation. No rumors traced back to print. It was as if the story had been intentionally left unwritten. That was not coincidence. Journalists depended on sources. Sources depended on access. And access depended on trust. When Harlem decided something was not to be discussed, it wasn't enforced through threats. It was enforced through silence. No one spoke because no one needed to. None came. Instead, his influence began to erode in ways he could not immediately counter. Deals took longer. Arrangements required more intermediaries. Information arrived late, or not at all. The neighborhood had not turned against him openly, but it had stopped accommodating him. Schultz was accustomed to opposition that could be challenged directly. He had faced enemies before. He had survived worse. But this was not opposition, it was exclusion. And exclusion, once normalized, was difficult to reverse. Bumpy Johnson remained publicly uninvolved. That was perhaps the most unsettling aspect. There were no sightings. No declarations. No visible consolidation of power. Johnson did not claim victory because there was none to claim publicly. The outcome did not belong to him alone. It belonged to the balance Harlem had chosen to preserve. People began to talk about the situation only in fragments. Not explanations. Not stories. Just observations. Someone mentioned that things felt different. Someone else noted that certain names no longer came up. Another remarked that it was best not to ask questions about what had happened. These comments were never connected. They didn't need to be. The city understood. Schultz, meanwhile, attempted to force clarity. He pushed for meetings that didn't materialize. He applied pressure where it once worked. Each attempt met the same result, not refusal, but deflection. The harder he pressed, the more isolated his position became. What made the situation irreversible was not retaliation, it was normalization. Harlem adapted to his diminished presence without discussion. Life continued. Business continued. The absence of Schultz's influence ceased to be remarkable. By the time Schultz recognized that something fundamental had shifted, there was no single decision to undo. No individual to confront. No event to retaliate against. The structure he had challenged had absorbed the disruption and moved forward without him. There were moments, later, remembered imperfectly, when Schultz tried to reassert himself. These efforts never became public, and they never achieved what he intended. The window for correction had closed not with violence, but with time. And time, in Harlem, was decisive. The most telling detail remained the record itself. Nothing was printed. No account of the confrontation appeared. No explanation of the shift followed. Histories written later softened the edges, merging the moment into broader narratives of decline and rivalry. The specificity of what happened, the line that was crossed and the response it triggered, was left vague. It was because those who knew understood that writing it down would change its meaning. The power of the moment lay in its discretion. In the understanding that some rules did not need enforcement once they were tested. Harlem had enforced its boundary without spectacle. That was the lesson. What happened after the confrontation was not meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt. In altered behavior. In changed expectations. In the quiet acknowledgement that certain approaches would no longer work. Schultz had believed that silence indicated weakness. Harlem used silence as a tool. By the time the story reached those who were not present, those who relied on papers, reports, and official accounts, the moment had already been absorbed into the city's fabric. The absence of documentation became part of the outcome. Those who asked questions were met with vague answers. Those who pushed for detail were discouraged. And eventually, curiosity faded, replaced by myth. That was how the line remained intact. It was crossed once, decisively. And afterward, no one needed to cross it again. Years later, when people tried to explain what had happened, they struggled to agree on the details. Not because the moment was unclear, but because it refused to fit into a single version. Everyone remembered it differently. Some insisted it had been inevitable. Others claimed it was avoidable. A few said nothing significant had happened at all. But no one denied the result. The city had adjusted. Dutch Schultz's presence in Harlem never fully recovered. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but permanently. His name still carried weight in certain places, his reputation remained formidable, but the unquestioned access was gone. The ease. The assumption that he could enter any room and dictate terms. That assumption had died quietly. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, did not emerge from the episode as a conqueror. There were no public victories to celebrate, no new titles claimed, no expansion announced. If anything, he became less visible. More deliberate. More selective. That, too, was intentional. Power that survives does not need to prove itself repeatedly. It needs only to be understood. What people remembered most wasn't the confrontation itself, it was the restraint that followed. The absence of chaos. The refusal to escalate. In a city accustomed to loud endings, this one faded instead, leaving behind a subtle but unmistakable shift. Over time, the story hardened into something closer to legend. You could hear it in the way older residents spoke, not with excitement, but with certainty. They didn't recount the moment to entertain. They mentioned it to explain how things worked. As a reminder of boundaries. Of what happened when someone mistook silence for weakness. No one framed it as a victory over Schultz. That would have missed the point. The neighborhood had long been underestimated by those who measured power only in numbers and noise. Harlem measured power in cohesion. In memory. In the shared understanding that certain lines existed for a reason. Once tested, those lines did not need to be defended again. The newspapers never told this version of the story. What they recorded were outcomes without causes. Declines without moments. Shifts attributed to broader forces rather than specific decisions. That omission was not an oversight, it was alignment. The story wasn't meant for print. Writing it down would have simplified it. Reduced it to personalities and drama. Stripped it of the collective intelligence that made it work. The truth lived elsewhere. It lived in altered routes and quieter conversations. In the way names were mentioned, or not. In how newcomers were cautioned gently, without explanation. In the shared understanding that some conflicts ended not with bloodshed, but with acknowledgement. That understanding lasted. Even as eras changed. Even as figures faded from prominence. Even as the city reinvented itself. The logic remained. Harlem remembered how it had handled the moment when pressure arrived and refused to leave. And that memory became precedent. Long after Schultz and Johnson were gone, the lesson persisted. Not as a story told outright, but as an instinct passed down. The sense that not every challenge required confrontation. That sometimes the most decisive response was withdrawal. That silence could be final. People searching for a clear moral often missed it. They wanted heroes and villains, winners and losers. But this story offered none of that. It offered something more durable. It showed how power could be exercised without spectacle. How authority could be preserved without display. How a community could assert itself without announcing its intentions. The line that was crossed in 1934 was never drawn on a map. It wasn't written into law. It wasn't enforced by decree. It existed because people believed in it. And once belief was tested and reaffirmed, the line no longer needed defense. That was why it was never printed. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was understood. And in Harlem, what was understood did not need explanation. The city moved on. But it never forgot.